Good afternoon. On behalf of the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, welcome to our discussion today with author Steve Feldstein to talk about his new book, The Rise of Digital Repression: How Technology Is Reshaping Power, Politics, and Resistance. We're proud to have Steve back with us. We had him on a panel earlier this year within the realm of our geotechnology program. We have been studying kind of the combined challenges of both the need for the U.S. to compete and win on the technical side of competition with China for advanced technologies, but also on the narrative side, the importance of laying out a compelling narrative dichotomy between the approach of authoritarian regimes and democratic free societies, and where our approach as democratic societies is superior from the point of view of the citizenry. And, our democracies can feel and appear messy at times, but at the end of the day, we strongly believe they deliver great value. They deliver a way of life which we think is one that deserves to be protected and has to be defended. So we appreciate Steve's role in doing the research and putting together a book on digital repression and helping all of us and our participants understand what we need to know about digital repression and that narrative conflict between open and closed societies. Today, we're going to have a conversation with Steve, moderated by CSPC Senior Fellow Zaid Zaid. Zaid is a good friend going back to our time together at Georgetown. Actually, we both spent time in the Foreign Service, and Zaid has been in senior positions with the State Department and with the White House, dealing with foreign policy, security, and digital issues, and is on the policy team at Facebook now, so very much engaged on some of these important questions. Thank you for joining us today. We expect there'll be an opportunity to put questions in to Steve through the Q&A function, but I know Zaid has a lot of ground he wants to cover with Steve on the book and on this important topic. So, Steve, thanks for being with us. Zaid, with that, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks for that introduction, Glenn. And thank you to the audience for being here and for joining us today. As Glenn mentioned, we have Steve Feldstein, who's a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and Democracy, Conflict, and Governance program, where he focuses on issues of democracy, technology, and human rights, U.S. foreign policy, and Africa. He previously served as the Frank and Bethune Church Chair of Public Affairs and Associate Professor at Boise State University. He also served in the Obama administration, where we worked together briefly at USAID. He was finished the Obama administration at the State Department as Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau. And before that, at USAID, he also previously served in the Senate. He has published a number of essays and articles in foreign affairs and foreign policy, MIT Technology Review, among others. He has a BA from Princeton and a JD from Berkeley. Just before turning it over to him, just a little bit of a run of the show. So he's going to talk about the book for about 15 minutes. And then we'll do a Q&A, questions that I have, questions we'll take from the audience. You can use the chat function to submit your questions, and then we'll pose them to Steve. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Steve.
Great. Well, thank you for the nice introduction, Zaid. And thanks also to Glenn for his remarks and for welcoming me back to the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress. It's always nice to participate in events with this group, and really look forward to an interesting dialogue for this hour. So as Glenn and Zaid mentioned, I have a new book out, The Rise of Digital Repression. And I wanted to offer some context and background in terms of the issues that the book touches upon, what they mean from a policy perspective, and how we should think about and understand these trends, especially as they relate to some of the more alarming questions in terms of the democracies and how they're proceeding, and they're in a relation with the other types of regimes and geopolitics. So this book represents 3+ years of research. Some of it was desk research, but a good portion involved going out to the field, going out to different countries, and conducting a steady stream of interviews with a wide variety of folks. So I ended up taking several trips out to places including Hong Kong, Thailand, the Philippines, and Ethiopia. And in all those, and 3 of those countries end up as separate chapters in the book. And in all those different visits, I was able to meet with a wide variety of stakeholders. Of course, civil society, digital rights activists, human rights, journalists, and so forth. But also, I really wanted to make an attempt to kind of meet with government officials, intelligence officers, politicians, supporters of some of the very autocrats that I discuss in the book to really understand incentives and motivations for why different types of technologies are used by governments, and how they're used, and in what form, and what the political effect of that is. And I think, again, part of the motivation itself for this book was just to bring a little bit of consistency, at least to my own thinking, in terms of better understanding, defining, and laying out what it is. Well, what are we actually talking about when we speak about issues like digital authoritarianism or digital repression? How do you define kind of a landscape or ecosystem of what these tools represent? And then how are they deployed? So maybe that, to me, is a good starting point for our conversation. I offer a definition of digital repression. That's the use of digital information and communications technology to surveil, coerce, or manipulate individuals or groups in order to deter specific activities or beliefs that challenge the state, which in of itself is a definition that's pretty close to how you would define political repression overall. But while that's sort of a top line understanding of what digital repression is, I think it's really important to kind of look at the tools and instruments that are actually deployed. And so to that end, I really look at sort of 5 buckets of techniques, one of which is surveillance. And that could be everything from the mass surveillance systems, facial recognition that you would see deployed in places like China, Saudi Arabia, and so forth. But it would also be targeted surveillance. So the kind of spyware and the hacking into mobile communications, different social media platforms, and so forth that you oftentimes see used against critics of a government. And second would be censorship. And again, censorship is pretty wide ranging. It's everything from blocking specific websites to taking down content on Twitter or Facebook by government via, to much more extensive systemic approaches, such as you would see in China or North Korea, in terms of going behind setting up a great firewall and filtering the type of content that citizens can access. Third is disinformation, social manipulation. And I think what's interesting about this in particular is that with disinformation, we think of that oftentimes as a tool of populism or extreme groups, but it really also can be a potent tool used by particular leaders to enact and advance their political objectives. And so one of the chapters in my book on the Philippines profiles the president, the head of state there, Rodrigo Duterte, who, for a variety of reasons, has ended up using these disinformation tools combined with, the persecution of government critics as a very strong rationale for staying in power. And so what he does is not only put forth government propaganda to convince the population via falsehoods that his policies are the right policies, but he also uses those very same tools and a whole army of cyber trolls to essentially intimidate, tarnish, harass critics of the government as well. And that's proven to be extremely effective as kind of a digital repression approach. Fourth would be internet shutdowns. And that is a phenomenon that you see both in democracies like India, but also authoritarian countries around the world. Um, it's a very simple technique. Ultimately, it involves everything from throttling the speed of internet connections to full-scale shutdowns or blocking certain social media apps, blocking connectivity in a region or nationwide. Oftentimes, you see it used in conjunction with major crackdowns, such as in Iran or Sudan or Ethiopia at various points, and they can also oftentimes be used in conjunction with the commission of atrocities on the ground. So that is a phenomenon and a trend that continues to persist. And then finally is the persecution against online users. So it's not just that one would persecute particular individuals, but it's that individuals within online following. Online journalists like Maria Ressa in in the Philippines, many others along those lines who are known for their influence on the internet. So that's kind of the broader array of instruments in terms of what we're talking about. And so then that kind of led into a few questions that I had that really sort of forms the initial basis of the book. One of the kind of key question is, well, is there a relationship when it comes to how digital repression is deployed and its linkage to certain types of political regimes? Is it something that's primarily used by authoritarian states? Is there a wider usage beyond just autocratic leaders to democracies as well? And if so, is there a variance in terms of what tools might be deployed? And what I found is that, one of the most salient predictors of the use of digital repression is the existence of pre-existing repression. So in other words, authoritarians who otherwise enact political repression are more apt to use some combination of these tools to coerce, intimidate, deter their citizens, which shouldn't come as a huge surprise, kind of given what we know about the logic of how authoritarian regimes work. But what is interesting is that even in authoritarian regimes, no two autocratic states use the same combination of tools. Some places, like Ethiopia or the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or will sort of rely much more on a combination of internet shutdowns, some degree of disinformation, and the persecution of online users. Other countries, like the Philippines, as I mentioned, Brazil, really rely upon disinformation as a primary tool to prop up their political regimes. And then other places like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, China, very much rely on a combination of surveillance, censorship, as well as persecution. So you can see there's a pretty wide array, even just among states that are sort of, more on the authoritarian side. But I think what's also interesting is that, countries like India, Brazil, Kenya, Nigeria, these are all countries that are, one would consider to be not liberal democracies, but weaker democracies, but still democratic nonetheless. They also rely upon these tools. And so, the notion that we can say digital repression is strictly an authoritarian phenomenon doesn't really hold water. I think there's a lot more of a nuance and a lot more back and forth when it comes to which regimes will use what kind of tools. And I think, in part, what's really interesting about digital repression is that, they offer a lot of advantages that, particularly if you are a hybrid regime where you have some degree of openness, where you at least put up the pretense of holding elections and want to pretend to some extent that you're open, but really you still want to ensure you have control over who gets elected, who is going to be the successor, and that ultimately the regime will stay in power. Digital tools offer that subtlety that traditional methods of repression sometimes do not. So, for example, take the difference between mass imprisonment of individuals who oppose the regime versus mass censorship online. Ultimately, you can get to the same outcome, which is essentially the suppression of dissent. But the difference is that on the one hand, when you have mass imprisonment, that takes a lot of investment in terms of your security forces. That oftentimes can lead to a huge amount of public backlash, not to mention reputational damage. Whereas the selective blocking of websites, the incessant calls for taking down of different content, well, that also can lead to concern. It's not the same level. And so that oftentimes can be a great tactic. Let's say you're Museveni in Uganda, who recently held yet another rigged election in the country. And in combination with that rigged election, did a number of things to both tax social media and to attack online influencers, particularly those linked to the opposition, via the internet, and then use some spyware surveillance as well. This is a great middle ground for someone like a Museveni to enact their repressive objectives without having to resort to the most heavy-handed tactics that you otherwise might have seen in the past. And so that explains to sort of one of the advantages that digital repression can sort of bring. Now, on the other hand, what's interesting about the kind of digital repression side is that it's not foolproof, and that oftentimes what you can see is something I wrote about in the book called The Digital Dictator's Dilemma, which is the sense that there's a fine balance between countries who, on the one hand, need to find a way to control the online environment in order to ensure that political control in their country, while on the other hand, needing to ensure a degree of openness so that they maintain innovation, economic prosperity, and not scare away foreign investment and external companies. And so you see countries like Thailand, really trying to thread that needle. So on the one hand, at times they really try to exert a large amount of control in terms of their internet environment, even trying to kind of create a internet gateway to control what comes in and out of the country in the digital space. On the other hand, given the backlash and concern from the middle class and from others that the economy would tank if they instituted such a control, the regime actually has backed away from implementing that gateway. And so that's the balance that a lot of regimes have. You can only go so far in terms of digital controls for the most part before you also have to recognize that there's an economic cost. A few countries have been able to get around that, and China is the primary example, where if you're big enough, if you have enough indigenous domestic industries, then you can get away with a lot, and companies will either want to still invest, or if they leave, like Google and Facebook, you can replace them with domestic companies, which is precisely what's happened. But China is an outlier, and for many other countries, the balance is much more different. So that's something that's sort of worth bearing in mind. I don't want to go on for too long. I want to kind of stop in a moment and kind of get to the Q&A. But I do want to sort of touch on two issues briefly before concluding. So one of which is that I think a fair question can be asked about whether digital repression is fundamentally tilting the playing field in favor of autocrats against civil society. And the answer is mixed on that front. I don't believe that we're at a moment where there is little hope for civil society, but I do think that it is a challenging environment for democratic movements and for protesters, and that in certain countries that already have existing high capacity coercive institutions. So think about a China or Russia. The addition of these tools makes it really hard to push back. And I think the landscape is grim. On the other hand, most countries don't have that level of sophistication when it comes to their intelligence services. And where governments have insufficient capacity to take advantage of these digital tools, then I think there's actually a lot of room to maneuver. And that the mobilization effects of these tools can really bring profound change. And so even while we perhaps won't see a similar cycle to the Arab Spring in the near future, the possibility does exist for mass protest movements to get momentum and to push back against some of the worst autocratic leaders around. Final thought, there's of course a big question about what do you do about these strategies, and what steps can democracies take. And I have sort of four ideas four principles that I think are kind of a good basis for discussion. So, one of which is that there are a lot of differences among democracies about some very thorny issues, everything from data privacy, platform accountability, how to approach disinformation, and in the regulatory responsibilities of the state. And these are real differences that will continue, that will need to be hashed out, and there are no easy solutions to figuring out a resolution to those. But at the same time, I think democracies have to also recognize that there's far more they have in common than differences, and that if they approach the challenges of these digital repression issues from a human rights basis and look for ways to work collectively to restrict exports to the worst authoritarian countries, to ensure a certain level of adherence to human rights responsibilities among different companies based in these democracies, and to push back normatively against the China's, Russia's, Iran's in the world, especially in multilateral fora, I think there can be I think it can make a real difference. I think second, when it comes to digital authoritarianism, liberal democracies have an obligation to look at home as much as they have an obligation to look abroad. There are enough issues at home when it comes to the spread of disinformation, when it comes to the type of companies that export invasive tools from democracy, based in democratic countries, to authoritarian states. That it's not just a China problem; it's also a look at home. How do we scrutinize our own conduct issue? Third, I think we have to remember that while technology certainly has changed the landscape in a lot of ways, I ultimately believe that repression, I look at repression based in terms of political contexts, and that does boil down to underlying politics. What are the incentives of the autocratic leader? If they're not going to access digital tools, if they're unable to do so, what will they then resort to? But I don't think we can separate the digital, the technological from the political. And then finally, I don't think digital repression is a one-way street. And despite a very challenging environment, which I've described, I do think it's a cat and mouse struggle, and that civic groups are doing remarkable things on the ground to innovate, to adapt, and to push back in small and big ways against authoritarian regimes. And while even in certain contexts like Myanmar or Belarus, the deck is stacked against these groups, they're still finding innovative ways to hold their ground. And with the support of democracies who can help nudge some of these efforts forward, again, I think breakthroughs are possible. So let me stop there. Turn it back over to you, Zaid, and I look forward to a good conversation.
Great, thanks so much for that. It's a great overview, and I just want to encourage the audience to any questions you have to put in the chat, and I'll get to them. I'll try to get to as many as possible. One question I have for you, Steve, is you talked about when you were doing your field research, you were on the ground, you were talking to human rights activists, politicians, security officials, etc. How open do you think people were being with you when they were talking about either what they were doing on the part of the government side, or the threats that they feel like they faced maybe on the civil society human rights side?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I don't purport to think that people don't have agendas that they wanted to push. That's something I certainly learned very well in my diplomatic, government experience. So there's always something in the back of my mind. I would say a few things. So first of all, when it came to civil society human rights groups, because in particular, I built up a lot of trust with different intermediaries who would vouch for me. And I have, especially when it comes to places like Ethiopia, I have longstanding contacts that I've worked with for years. I feel like that what I got was a pretty unvarnished take, and frankly, a lot of people, as you'll see in the book, wanted to be off the record, and they wanted to be off the record because what they were saying was candid and could really get them into trouble. And I, obviously respect that, and that was the first question I asked was, what are the ground rules that you were comfortable with, right? So I think certainly on the human rights civil society side, I felt pretty good. I mean, the other thing too I did was I would constantly vet and double check what people would say. And so it was really interesting because, you start, like, maybe you meet with a few different government officials, and then you sort of check what they say with different human rights activists, and you sort of work off, different narratives that are there. And so you're constantly kind of questioning and probing and asking and trying to figure out what exactly kind of makes sense. I will say on the intelligence side, also really fascinating. So for the most part, people who are kind of on higher levels in government or in security agencies wanted to talk off the record, and certainly they had their own agendas to kind of push. And absolutely, I needed to kind of check and double check and verify. But what I was surprised by was they would tell me things that didn't really add up to what I would expect to be the standard line. They would say things, in terms of, well, you guys are so worried about China all the time. Well, let me tell you where I'm really getting some of my equipment from, in addition to China. Things that were eye-opening without a clear purpose, other than to sort of just tell me what they think. I mean, people really like to talk at the end of the day. I mean, that's the gratifying thing, whether having pineapple smoothies with Thai intelligence officials, off campus, or meeting, the former head of the Ethiopian intelligence, agency up in a hotel in Tigray before war broke out. The interviews themselves really stuck with me, and probably were the most enjoyable and eye-opening part of doing this research.
Great. When I was working at a law firm, one of the partners there told me that sometimes you just let that awkward silence hang, and people will start talking and telling you things you didn't ask. And I imagine that probably happened a couple times with you. It's a great tactic for doing interviews. Um, I wonder, of the four places you went, which one did you feel like, and granted, you did say that that different places were using different tactics, and so everyone wasn't necessarily doing the same thing. But which place was the most repressive, would you say, in the kinds of tactics they were using?
Yeah. Well, yeah. Well, so I'll say this. When I went to Ethiopia at the time, there was actually a lot more promise than kind of what we see now as a sort of grimmer landscape. So I went to Ethiopia right before the pandemic broke out, and there were actually there were rumblings of tensions with the TPLF, the Tigray, up in that region, and the current president Abiy, but those hadn't quite manifested yet into something that actually resembled kind of the armed struggle that was there. And so Ethiopia, which I would have expected ordinarily to have been in that realm, was much freer, much more open than I had ever seen in my past experience. So that then leaves Thailand and the Philippines, and certainly Thailand was one of those places where there was a lot of paranoia. Both because at the time they had the junta, the military junta, which had kind of taken over in a coup, was still in power, and they were sort of transitioning over to elections, which were of course lopsided and rigged. But at the time they were still kind of in this sort of quasi-military government, and so there I felt there was a lot of repression and a lot of kind of like looking behind your shoulder, particularly on sensitive issues. But I would say also what's interesting in the Philippines is that despite having a very freewheeling environment, I mean, there are real things happening there, not just digital repression, but a drug war with 30,000 plus having been killed. Many by vigilante and paramilitary groups. So even in a place that where people I think are freer traditionally to speak their minds and who have less of a censor in terms of what they say, even in a context like that, I mean, there was a real fear or recognition that the Duterte government was not above using hit squads and other sorts of things to silence critics, or at least to imprison them. Which, in fact, while one of the people I communicated with in the Philippines, Senator Leila de Lima, we communicated via email. She's in jail. She still is in prison. I mean, she's a political prisoner. I mean, imagine that. And I mean, any other kind of functioning democracy having a sitting senator on trumped up charges, languishing in jail for years. I mean, that's the situation that we're in the Philippines. So each is repressive in their own way, I guess, is kind of my takeaway.
As you mentioned Duterte in the Philippines, and I'm thinking about our previous president and sort of like the outsized influence that he had on our online conversation. I'm wondering, for Duterte or for others, how much of this is them? How much are they personally driving either the conversation when it comes to disinformation or censorship, or how much are they relying on the other levers of the state to do this?
It's a great question. And it's a little bit of both. And I would sort of say, well, I would say a couple things to kind of just like frame the answer, right? So the first frame is that if Duterte, as a populist representing that kind of end, had not been elected, what would democracy look like in the Philippines? And I think it would look radically different, because he was the only candidate, really, of all those who were vying, who really came from these sort of had these illiberal populist motives. And he was really the only one who was able to kind of exploit, particularly Facebook, to the extent he did, to both get elected and then to kind of consolidate and perpetuate his rule. So one of the things I think that's distinctive in general is that Duterte is very unique to where the Philippines is at the moment. And if you kind of took him out of the equation, you might not see the same kind of dynamics. That being said, Duterte builds on a kind of a populist tradition that has been in place in the Philippines, not to mention a weak and at times corrupt governance system that I think has made citizens very frustrated, and has opened up their willingness to embrace a strong man because with their belief that he'll fix things and help serve the common person. So there are structural problems leading up to Duterte that have allowed him to kind of take control the way he has. But then so then now we're at this place where he clearly has built up a disinformation machine. And you can ask, is it Duterte or is the machine frankly bigger than him? And I guess we'll see. I mean, there's national elections next year. He's termed out by constitutionally. So, assuming that doesn't change, he may his daughter may end up running, for president. But it's unclear whether his sort of imprint will last beyond himself. I think is a great question. And then also, I would say whether the disinformation machine that he's built, that's been funded, that relies on a wide variety of actors to actually implement on a day in basis, will that have an effect in terms of pushing his brand of populism so that another person in his likeness is elected? Or will it be kind of more cyclical? Will you see kind of a reversal of populism, at least for the next head of state, and something back to more of a democratic leader? I mean, I think these are really great questions to kind of watch and see how they evolve. But certainly, the machine he's built and that he's funded at the moment right now is very potent.
So as you were talking about the way in which he, sort of built his infrastructure around digital repression, it made me, think about some of these other countries and how they do it. Foremost in my head is just, I guess, Russia. The way in which they involved themselves in the U.S. election, not just in 2016, but obviously in 2020. I mean, some of that was carried out by their intelligence services. I think about India, where the government has been really aggressive in trying to get social media companies to take down certain content. There was a story in the New York Times recently about the term Indian variant of COVID-19. So some of these places are using the sort of normal, I would say, infrastructure of the state, in their tools for digital repression. But one, do you agree? And then two, how many people are they employing to do this? Like what's the infrastructure that they're using? Is some of it secretive and you weren't able to, quite understand how this was happening? Or is it really just using our normal or their normal, state infrastructure to carry out these tactics?
Yeah, no, it's a really, really good question. And, each situation varies a little bit in terms of how it works. But I think the model tends to be, and certainly the Philippines is a good example of this, and Thailand as well, where they tend to sort of outsource a lot of this to individuals or groups who are funded by the state, but maybe in a more surreptitious way, or one where where there's like a little bit of oftentimes there can be a little bit of a gap between them, but they're operating under the guidance or direction of the state. So what you might see in the Philippines, for example, is that you will see, when I was there, the kind of presidential spokesperson, Panelo, would kind of come out with the top lines of the day or every couple days. These like so-and-so journalists are operating under foreign funding and trying to hurt our dear president who's fighting for the people. And then you would kind of see that messaging kind of filter on down and get echoed by a very large kind of, army of trolls that would sort of, put in place specific hashtags, building on that messaging, would tag particular individuals who were to be kind of particularly harassed based on that messaging, would bring in different kind of false or misleading evidence to kind of reinforce the messaging and so forth. So it's very much kind of like this self-reinforcing circle of like outside state-sponsored, state-funded trolls, influencers who might get payments under the table or have their own motivations to try to parrot this messaging, and then also messaging coming directly from the presidential palace as well. So kind of like this sort of circular kind of momentum. Now, what's also interesting too is that there's several people who have done some interesting studies in the Philippine context, particularly Jonathan Ong and Jason Cabañas came out with a study when I was there on the Disinformation network that Duterte set up. They have relied a lot on sort of these PR marketers who it's really like a kind of like a pyramid where you have kind of people at the top who then take the messages from the presidential palace, put it on down. But at the very bottom level, you have hundreds of these kind of operators who are sort of tweeting out constantly throughout the day what they're sort of told to put out. And so, like that's not the only way things happen, but it certainly is a model that you've seen in a lot of different countries, these sort of large scale troll armies, but this sort of back and forth narrative messaging that's coordinated, through official channels.
Great, thanks. I'm going to start mixing in a couple of questions that we've gotten from the audience with my own questions. This question is very definitively from someone in the audience. It involves Facebook, so this is given my own affiliation with Facebook. This is not coming from me. I'll just say that up front. So it was found that Facebook provided 90% of the news to the public in Myanmar. The Myanmar military, after having been trained in Russia on information warfare tactics, used 10 or so Facebook accounts to manipulate the public against the Rohingya. Facebook is a US company. What do you think the US government must do, if anything, to regulate the use of Facebook, as well as other social media sites, as a tool as information warfare?
Yeah. Well, I think certainly the question of social media platforms is a really relevant one, an important one. And it's something, and whether we're looking at the situation in Myanmar or conversely the situation in the Philippines. I mean, it's similar in that I think something like 97% of all users online have accounts or use Facebook in the Philippines. In fact, I think it leads the world in terms of Facebook users. And so you can't disaggregate one from the other. And in many countries, the internet is Facebook and sort of vice versa as people perceive it. So there is a lot of responsibility, I think, when it comes to platforms having to scrutinize carefully what they've enabled and abetted and where kind of culpability lies. And I explored this question in a section, in the Philippines chapter in terms of, it's entitled like, "What Facebook's culpability?" I think what's important is that there's responsibility all around. Certainly, there's responsibility from social media companies, and that's probably in terms of how to address those issues and to what extent more can be done, or how what kind of structural broader reforms we need to consider. That's probably enough of a conversation for a future session. But I would also just want to point out too that I don't think we can give a pass either to those politicians, those actors themselves who see an opportunity to exploit a platform and do so in a very deliberate fashion. I mean, as I mentioned with the Philippines, they have funded, organized a hierarchical network to systematically disseminate out propaganda and harass critics. And so, in a context like that, there's a lot of, I think we have to ascribe the agency to those individuals who choose to undertake those actions, just as much as we also need to ask very difficult and tough questions when it comes to platform transparency and accountability of social media platforms. So there's a lot of work to be done all around, and I think we are just at the starting point in terms of actually, getting a better handle on how best to address these challenges.
Thanks. And I would say that, I do think that social media companies do see themselves as having responsibility. And you can see that in the resources that they've dedicated to a lot of, different regions, different countries, different languages, et cetera, and trying to ensure that they are able to respond to some of the challenges that that are occurring over time. To switch back a little bit, wanted to ask about the role of China. You did mention this in your introductory remarks, is that, there were, maybe some people told you that it wasn't just China, but maybe it was also coming from some other countries as well. But, to what extent is China responsible for sort of spreading digital technology that's used in digital repression?
Yeah. So this is a tough question. And this is one that, I think is really kind of part of a very important political debate that we're having in the United States and among democracies right now, in terms of, what is China's culpability, and, how do you kind of push back against what they're doing, but also, is that enough? Is that sufficient? And so my sort of conclusion on this is that I think we have to absolutely take seriously the authoritarian mindset that the CCP brings, that the influence that it is, brought to bear in certain countries has been pretty profound, particularly on the digital technology front, and that even if there isn't sort of direct modeling occurring, there's a lot of parallel modeling that takes place where countries will kind of see what China is able to do and want to emulate certain aspects of that and acquire certain surveillance technical capabilities or so forth. So that's a very real thing. And I would also say on the normative level, in terms of kind of the push amongst international organizations and kind of standard setting bodies and so forth, and China, along with other autocratic countries like Russia and Iran, are really making a big push against kind of international legal human rights principles that have been kind of embedded in this arena for a really long time. So it's a very serious threat on that front. But what I can also mention directly in the book is that in many of these countries, the more important salient factors when you look at individual leadership incentives on the ground is in China, it's their actual repressive objectives they have in mind in order to stay in power, right? And so, look at Ethiopia is a great case in point, where you have a long-standing partnership with the Chinese, especially when it comes to building their ICT networks with ZTE. But you also have a lot of sourcing of spyware and other cybersecurity capabilities by the security agencies in Ethiopia from European and U.S. Companies. And that's something that the, I include in the book, the ex-head of INSA in Ethiopia, the intelligence, technology division, said directly to me. He said, look, it's not just a China issue by any means. And, there are a wide variety of ways that you can, or reasons for why it is that U.S. companies, or even, kind of on an intelligence kind of sharing aspect, we have worked with these regimes, and they have then turned and used these tools in exploitive ways. But it is a nuanced and difficult question, and the pushing back on China will bring dividends in certain areas, but it won't turn these countries democratic, because there are many other ways in which they're sourcing these technologies, and there's many more motivations and factors when it comes to the logic of their rule. And that's the kind of point I want to make, that essentially it's complicated, and China is one of a number of factors when it comes to understanding and unpacking what is driving digital repression in these different contexts.
And so on the flip side of that, what can democracies, or how can they better work together to counter digital repression and to build a compelling narrative of superiority of approaches from open societies? What do they have to bring to some of the countries that you surveyed and visited?
Right. Well, we talked about parallel modeling a second ago. I think with the with a number of liberal democracies, first of all, part of it is actually sort of doing the work that's needed at home. When it comes to disinformation, when it comes to accountability for human rights abuses, when it comes to how surveillance is employed, by different police forces, and so forth. Part of it is sort of putting in place the right regulatory framework, putting in place the right protections when it comes to privacy, being forward-leaning when it comes to ensuring that companies adhere to human rights due diligence questions. So that part of my answer is, if we do the work, if democracies do the work domestically, that will have positive spillover effects abroad. I think, but that's obviously sort of one of those like necessary but not sufficient type of approaches, because we also need to do more. And I think part of it also is coming together in certain contexts and figuring out what are the drivers of some of these trends, and then determining what are the points of leverage that can be used to push back. So if you look at a country, like Thailand, or you look at a country like the Philippines, and especially if you try to approach, come up and construct different approaches multilaterally with the Europeans, with the Canadians, with New Zealand, with Australia, as opposed to kind of going it alone. That could be a force multiplier in terms of convincing a Thai regime maybe not to censor or request a takedown of the level of content that it does, or maybe cause the Philippines government to rethink purchasing a multi-million-dollar surveillance system from China, or in the case of India right now, or Ethiopia, which was recently announced, causing them to decide to adopt 5G systems from democratic countries as opposed to Chinese alternatives. So these are all different kind of, the different contexts matter, but these are strategies that I think can be leveraged.
Great. Got another audience question from Luke Wentz. He says, Steve, thanks for being here and for writing a great book. I found it particularly interesting that after the Thai courts formally dissolved the Future Forward Party, the root sentiments unleashed by FFP not only persevered, but have gained in momentum, and the formal dissolution gave the movement increased validity and recognition. At what point is government intervention in subversive resistive movements counterproductive?
Well, good question. Hi, Luke. Thanks for the point. It's really interesting. He's right. When I was in Thailand at the time, the Future Forward Party was this new party that formed, mostly online, very youth oriented, led by a telegenic billionaire, Thanatorn, and they had just had elections, and they did surprisingly well. And so this is where the rigged part of the elections came in. Ultimately, they were kind of locked out of power. They were then persecuted through a series of legal maneuvers, and finally they were forced to disband and dissolve as an actual political entity. And really, the only reason they were forced to dissolve was that they were they did too well. They were too much of a threat to the Thai state, and so that's what occurred. And so, what was the result of that? I think in some ways, using for governments, they say oftentimes think, well, if we just dissolve an organization, that'll essentially take care of the biggest immediate threat, and we can sort of move on. But citizens sometimes don't take kindly to that, and there's been a real backlash, particularly a generational backlash that's curiously cut across many of the traditional divides in Thai society between rural and urban, and high income, low income. And so what you see is that rather than break the back of the kind of youthful citizens who powered Future Forward to begin with, instead it has galvanized a continuing and ongoing set of demonstrations against the sort of Thai monarchy and the military establishment that I think over the long term will really end up challenging their hegemony and will bring change. And so, I think that you can formally cut off a movement, but you can't necessarily kill the spirit of a movement, at least not easily.
Great. A question from CSPC Senior Fellow Robert Gerber, who I know you know. So he asks, China analyst Emily Dula-Briere, sorry if I messed up her name, recently said, what matters today is the application of science and technology, the sort of networks you build for it. For example, your ability to deploy telecommunications. It's not that you got the patent, it's that you've got its application internationally. The Chinese orientation appeared to be focusing on that, which creates this tremendous asymmetry vis-a-vis the United States and really vis-a-vis the entire global system. How would you respond to her comments there?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to her point, and I think I kind of read through a little more of where those comments kind of emanated from, and one of the kind of bigger points she made too is that you can invest all you want in terms of R&D and creating all the innovation, and then the Chinese will sort of take it, lock it into their own systems, and it won't really matter at all in terms of who actually controls networks at the end of the day. And that to me sort of sounds like a call to make sure that rather than just innovating and kind of leaving it to countries to decide, or the ostensible free market, which China has never fully believed in anyway, you have to do more to stack the deck in favor of companies based in democracies and the types of systems that they would operate. And I think the USG has had a kind of slow waking realization that taking a fully laissez-faire, hands-off approach doesn't really work, particularly in contrast to China's industrial-led model. And so, as I mentioned, Ethiopia, what happened with the 5G consortium just last week, it was a really interesting case in point where the U.S. DFC, kind of new agency, provided a $500 million worth of loan guarantees, to sweeten the consortium's bid against the rival Chinese-backed consortium, and ultimately won the bid. And that matters because that's precisely the type of network I think that Emily's referring to in terms of who will actually establish and build 5G in a country that very much is competitive and is a swing state in the classic sense. And so, like that needs to be an increasing part of our approach. And I think it's good to see that strategically we seem to have started to reorient the ship, and that this, more and more will be part of how we think about, geopolitical competition. That we have to put our thumbs on the scale when it comes to democracies. We can't just hope for, the type of outcomes that we would like to see.
Great, thanks. I hope I did your question justice, Robert. I know, I believe you're on the phone. So one of the things that that you didn't focus on, but one of the things that I'm interested in is like how states might use technology to entrap folks who either they just don't like, or who are human rights activists, who are critical of the regime. One example, and they may still be doing this, I'm not entirely sure, but in the early 2000s, Egypt was using a tactic where they were entrapping LGBTQ people online through online dating, and they were sort of, then arresting them for being gay, taking them to jail, etc. Have you seen other examples of where like technology was used to try to entrap or try to go after civil society, either civil society or just normal citizens, because the country didn't approve of whatever they were doing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think it's something that is very persistent and occurs. And I guess in some ways, I think like what we're seeing with disinformation is a variation of that, where if you're peddling a lie that has little or no basis, or you're manipulating images and then purporting to demonstrate that someone is trafficking in drugs when they're not, or carrying out an illicit affair when they're not, or being corrupt when they're not. I mean, that's entrapment, as far as I'm concerned. And certainly, as I mentioned, not just in the Philippines context, but around the world, all over, in democracies and autocracies, it's a pretty time-honored technique. Just recently, we had, sort of your classic fake journalists taping involving, NED and Belarus, where someone purporting to be part of the Belarus opposition against Lukashenko actually was, I think, a Russian troll, ended up trying to get on record democracy activists in terms of ways in which they're trying to counter legitimately the violations, the depredations of that regime. And so this is new. It's part of this kind of continuing set of. I mean, these are tactics that we saw very often in the Cold War, and in the moment that we're in right now, particularly with kind of heightened geopolitical competition, but also kind of more of a diffusion of technology, so that countries can do clever things with very little actual capacity or investment. And then now, with like even the advent of deep fakes and so forth. I mean, this is the world we're living in. So, far from being something that we saw as a blip, I would say these are part of the battle lines that we're going to have to deal with in terms of legitimate information, truth, objectivity. I mean, just look at our own domestic struggles we have right now when it comes to far right extreme groups and what they're peddling and how they're trying to falsely bring in individuals on lies. It's all part of a tapestry, I think, that goes from one end to another and is very alarming.
You brought up deep fakes, and yeah, they scare me, and I think it's only going to get the technology is only going to get better. It's going to get faster, and it's going to be harder to detect as technology improves. And it'll be a big challenge, I think, for all of us who work in anything related to technology, and probably even politics, because people will use that to possibly go after other candidates to pretend that they said something that they didn't say or did something they didn't do. I'm interested in civil society and how they have pushed back against digital repression, how successful they've been, what has worked. I know you mentioned Maria Ressa earlier. I know that she's been a very vocal advocate, for disinformation in the Philippines, but just sort of like, what has their experience been? What did you hear on the ground from them about not just some of the challenges that they face, but also some of the successes maybe that they've had in fighting back?
Yeah. It is, I really, my heart goes out to the courage that groups like Rappler, and many others, that they demonstrate on a day in, day out basis when it comes to taking on a much more powerful adversary and persisting, despite threats to their life, and harms that may ensue. And that includes Maria Ressa, who's currently, facing significant charges and potentially a long jail time for speaking the truth. So, on the one hand, it's tough, it's daunting. On the other hand, the stories that they've broken, the disinformation networks that they have uncovered, their constant holding to account government lies and disinformation, has been, has really, I think, also spotlighted the inconsistencies of the regime itself. I mean, without them there, how would we even know so much of what we do know? I mean, you asked me earlier on, like, to what extent do I understand or know a bit about how disinformation is spread? To what extent to what kind of reach does it have? Who are some of the main nodes when it comes to diffusing particular types of information? How does the interaction work between the palace and influencers and these different trolls? And so much of that work has been built up, very painstakingly by groups like Rappler, often in conjunction with other researchers, to kind of document and paint a picture that gives us an understanding of what's happening in the Philippines, but also provides important lessons, I think, for other countries in terms of how these networks persist and what steps are needed to fight back against them. And so in that sense, it is both, they are both operating under duress and also providing an important light, for individuals to better understand how to combat and push back against these strategies. And they're not the only ones. I mean, look at everything from groups like Bellingcat, who've kind of pioneered open source intelligence, and others, and their work is making a difference in terms of holding to account oppressive governments and illiberal autocrats.
There's Glenn Nye, kind of like that, that person at the Oscars who tells you to stop talking, your time is over. So, but before I get to Glenn, I do want to give Steve a quick opportunity to tell us what you're working on next.
Yeah, thanks. Well, as you mentioned, I'm a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment, and I'm continuing to kind of push ahead with this line of work to look at the kind of convergence of digital technology and democracy. One thing that's coming in the near future is that I've assembled a digital democracy network of people who are from around the world, are actively looking on the ground about what these issues mean, how they're changing and emerging. And so we have a big kind of publication that I hope to see out this summer, and I will be sure to let folks know about that. But that's one of a number of issues that kind of I'm pushing ahead via Carnegie.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for joining us here, and I'll turn it over to Glenn.
Well, thank you, Zaid, for managing a great conversation. And Steve, thanks for coming back. It was great to see you again, and we really appreciate the work you put into the rise of digital repression, how technology is reshaping power, politics, and resistance. Really interesting conversation today. A lot more to cover on this particular topic. But it's clear that transparency is an important part of the challenge here that you've discussed, and especially in free societies, the discussing of these difficult problems, the uses of these tools, and when they're used for the wrong ends, it's important that we shed as much light on those things as possible. And I appreciate your efforts, Steve, to help educate us and the public on what we need to know about this topic. So thanks for doing that and for spending this time with us today. And we'll look forward to having you back again sometimes. And thanks to our participants for joining us. have a safe and happy Memorial Day weekend. We'll see you all soon. Take care.